In the golden age of Hollywood, when the cameras were soft, the lights were blinding, and every smile was carefully controlled, two women stood at the very top of the industry, and slowly became its most unforgettable enemies. Those women were Bette Davis and Joan Crawford. But this was never just a story about jealousy, and it was never just about who got the better role. This was a war over power, a war over legacy, and most of all, a war over survival. Hollywood loved young faces. It celebrated fresh beauty, and it quietly erased women the moment they stopped fitting the fantasy. For actresses in the studio era, there were no second chances. There were no reinventions. Once the audience moved on, the industry moved faster. And both Bette Davis and Joan Crawford knew it. They were not simply fighting each other. They were fighting time. They were fighting studios that treated actresses like disposable property. They were fighting producers who whispered that their best years were already behind them. And they were fighting an industry that had no idea what to do with powerful women once they grew older. From the outside, the headlines painted this as petty drama. Two divas, two egos, two stars who just couldn't stand to share the spotlight. But behind the camera, the truth was much darker. Bette Davis had built her reputation on fearless performances, on refusing to be pretty when the story demanded something ugly and real. She challenged directors. She challenged scripts. She challenged the very idea of what a leading lady was supposed to be. Joan Crawford, on the other hand, had survived Hollywood by mastering reinvention. She learned how to sell an image, how to command publicity, and how to turn herself into a brand long before anyone used that word. Two completely different survival strategies, one brutal industry, and only a few roles left for women their age. Every casting call felt like a warning. Every press interview felt like a quiet comparison. Every success for one woman felt like a threat to the other. This rivalry didn't grow out of hatred. It grew out of fear. Fear of becoming irrelevant. Fear of being replaced. Fear of being remembered only as a fading face in an old black and white movie. And what makes this story matter today is that their feud didn't just shock Hollywood, it changed it. Because what happened between these two women would force studios to confront something they had been avoiding for decades. That older actresses still had value, still had power, still had audiences willing to watch them. This is not just gossip from classic cinema. This is the story of how two women, locked in the same ruthless system, helped rewrite the future of Hollywood by refusing to disappear. Two queens from very different worlds. Hollywood crowned them both as queens, but the truth is, they were raised by completely different worlds. On one side stood Bette Davis, sharp-tongued, intense, and dangerously honest in a business built on illusion. Bette didn't arrive in Hollywood looking for fame. She arrived looking for work, real work. She wanted characters that broke rules, women who were complicated, unpleasant, ambitious, angry, and painfully human. While most actresses were pushed into soft romances and polite smiles, Bette chased stories that scared other stars away. She didn't care if the lighting made her look older. She didn't care if a role made her look cruel. What mattered to her was respect. Not applause, not glamour, respect. Directors quickly learned that Bette Davis was not easy to control. She questioned lines, she challenged weak scenes, and when a role felt empty, she fought to reshape it. In a studio system built on obedience, that made her powerful and dangerous. Across the same city, living under the same studio lights, was a woman who had survived a very different road. That woman was Joan Crawford. Joan did not build her career on rebellion, she built it on transformation. She understood something about Hollywood that Bette never tried to master. Image was currency, and she learned how to spend it perfectly. Every hairstyle, every photograph, every public appearance was carefully designed. Joan created herself again and again, reshaping her identity to match what audiences wanted to see. She didn't just play a star, she manufactured one. Where Bette chased artistic truth, Joan chased emotional connection with the public. She studied fans. She listened to studio publicity departments. She learned how to turn attention into protection. For Joan Crawford, survival meant staying visible, staying admired, staying desirable in a world that punished women the moment admiration faded. And that difference created a quiet emotional divide between them. Bette Davis believed greatness came from performance. Joan believed greatness came from presence. One trusted the craft, the other trusted the camera. One wanted to be remembered as the greatest actress in the room. The other wanted to be remembered as the woman the world could never stop watching. Underneath it all, both women were driven by the same fear, but they spoke completely different emotional languages. Bette Davis wanted to conquer Hollywood. Joan Crawford wanted to outlive it. And that contrast between raw artistic hunger and carefully engineered stardom would soon place them on a collision course neither of them could escape. Because when only one spotlight is left, two queens can never stand beneath it for long. The silent tension before the explosion. Long before the headlines screamed about feuds and the gossip columns fanned the flames, the rivalry between Bette Davis and Joan Crawford began quietly, almost invisibly. It wasn't a clash of dramatic tantrums on set. It wasn't public insults shouted across award shows. Not yet. It started in whispers. Whispers of casting calls. Whispers in the studio hallways. Whispers in the pages of magazines. Every role mattered. Every decision was scrutinized. And the studio system, designed to create stars, also loved its drama. It thrived on comparisons, turning minor tensions into newsworthy rivalries. Imagine the scene, a producer quietly choosing a lead actress for a film, a reporter jotting down names in the corner, a fan magazine printing Bette Davis or Joan Crawford on the cover. Each of these small moments stacked together, building an invisible wall between the two women. Bette had her uncompromising approach to acting. She was fearless in tackling roles others would avoid. She demanded scripts that challenged her, that made audiences feel something uncomfortable. Meanwhile, Joan had mastered the art of image, knowing how to charm the public, the press, and studio executives. Individually, both women were unstoppable, but side by side, the studio system began nudging them toward collision. Hollywood had a way of turning ambition into rivalry. It whispered comparisons into casting rooms. It encouraged competition for awards, public praise, and even the simplest fan adoration. In essence, the industry fed the fire slowly, quietly, methodically. Even the press played its part. One article would praise Bette for her raw talent. The next would highlight Joan's elegance and charm. Fans began to compare. Executives began to compare. And the actresses, they noticed. Small slights, imagined or real, started to build tension. Perhaps a studio executive favored one for a leading role over the other. Perhaps a director complimented one in front of the other. Each tiny decision was magnified into significance. By the time the cameras rolled on projects that put them face to face, the tension had been quietly simmering for years. And it didn't take much for that pressure to explode into something the world would never forget. Because Hollywood didn't just create stars, it created stories. And sometimes the most compelling stories were the ones that happened off-screen, in the shadows, between two women who were destined to collide. How the industry pushed them into competition. Hollywood in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s wasn't just a dream factory, it was a battlefield. And the rules were simple. There were only so many leading roles, only so much public attention, only so many awards, and only so many years before the industry decided you were too old to matter. For Bette Davis and Joan Crawford, this wasn't a rumor, it was reality, and it was relentless. The studio system controlled everything. Casting decisions weren't just about talent, they were about contracts, box office potential, and how many actresses the studio could keep under contract at the same time. There weren't enough top roles to go around. Every film, every leading part became a competition, and the stakes weren't small. A single role could make or break a career, especially for women, whom Hollywood viewed as having an expiration date. Public attention mattered just as much. Studios carefully curated images, photos, and interviews to make stars shine. But if the cameras favored one actress, another would inevitably feel invisible. Magazines would pit actresses against each other, subtly framing comparisons that amplified tension. Every smile, every press appearance, every award nomination became a marker in the unspoken hierarchy. Awards were another battlefield. Recognition wasn't just about prestige, it was survival. Winning could extend a career. Losing could mean fading from the spotlight. And when two women of equal fame and ambition were up for the same accolades, the rivalry became unavoidable. For Bette, awards validated her craft. For Joan, they validated her presence. Hollywood made sure they both knew the stakes. And then there was the harshest reality: aging. Hollywood had little patience for women as they grew older. Leading ladies were expected to remain youthful, desirable, and magnetic. Once that image faltered, roles disappeared. That ticking clock forced Bette and Joan into constant competition, not just against each other, but with the system itself. This rivalry was not personal in the beginning. It wasn't about jealousy over a hairstyle or a line of dialogue. It was structural. It was embedded in the very framework of Hollywood. The industry made two brilliant, ambitious women occupy the same spotlight and then whispered that only one could survive at the top. Bette Davis and Joan Crawford didn't just clash, they were caught in a machine that pitted women against women. And in the pressure cooker of studios, contracts, publicity, and aging, their rivalry was inevitable. Hollywood didn't create enemies, they created legends. Because in a system designed to discard actresses too soon, survival wasn't just about talent. It was about outlasting, outshining, and refusing to step aside. And that's exactly what these two women did. The film that locked them in the same room. It was 1962, and Hollywood was buzzing with anticipation and a little bit of fear. Because for the first time in years, two of its most powerful, most legendary, and most famously competitive actresses were about to be forced into the same room. The film? Whatever Happened to Baby Jane? And the casting? Well, it sent shockwaves across the industry. Imagine it. Bette Davis, known for her fierce intensity, her raw, uncompromising approach to acting, and her ability to terrify audiences with a single look. On the other side, Joan Crawford, whose elegance, glamour, and careful cultivation of public image had made her a Hollywood icon. And now, the two women were not just co-starring, they were playing sisters trapped in a psychological nightmare. Hollywood executives knew what they were doing. They weren't naive. They understood that these two women, with decades of history between them, would bring tension, drama, and publicity to every frame. And boy, did it work. From the moment the first press release hit, the gossip columns lit up. Bette Davis versus Joan Crawford screamed headlines. Two legends, one film, who will survive? Photographers chased them to premieres. Fans debated endlessly. And behind the cameras, both women knew this was more than a role. This was a battle. The film itself was dark, twisted, and theatrical, perfect fuel for the rivalry. Bette played baby Jane Hudson, a former child star whose fame had faded into madness. Joan played her sister Blanche, trapped and oppressed, the victim of Jane's jealousy and cruelty. The characters mirrored reality in a way that was impossible to ignore. Every scene demanded intensity. Every line became a test of endurance, a fight for dominance on screen and off. Suddenly, what had once been whispered tensions, subtle competitions, and behind-the-scenes maneuvering became public spectacle. The world could watch, and Hollywood was hooked. In forcing these two queens into the same project, the studio had done more than cast a movie. They had reignited a rivalry that had been simmering quietly for years. Public fascination exploded. Critics watched not just the story on screen, but the electricity between the actresses. And audiences? They couldn't look away. Whatever Happened to Baby Jane wasn't just a film, it was the arena in which two legends, two survivors of Hollywood's brutal machine, would finally confront each other, and the world would never forget it. What really happened on set? From the moment cameras started rolling on Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, the set became more than a workplace. It became a battlefield. It wasn't loud shouting matches in the hallways. It wasn't the kind of drama that makes tabloid covers. No, what happened on that set was far more intense, far more psychological. The tension was subtle, creeping into every scene, every line read, every glance. And because both Bette Davis and Joan Crawford were consummate professionals, it was all hidden behind the veneer of acting. Small humiliations became routine. Bette would reportedly question wardrobe choices in ways that undermined Joan's confidence. Joan, in turn, would arrive on set at the last possible moment, ensuring Bette had to wait, simmering in anticipation before the scene even started. Each act, minor on its own, built a wall of tension that no one could ignore. Then came the passive-aggressive behavior. On a scene where the two sisters were supposed to be intimate and tense, one might deliberately delay a line, misplace a prop, or misread a cue, not to sabotage the film entirely, but to assert dominance. It was an unspoken war of control, a way to show who would dictate the energy of the scene without ever breaking character. Psychological games were the most dangerous. Both women knew how to exploit insecurities. Bette, with her fearlessness, would push Joan to react emotionally, drawing subtle expressions that could be edited for dramatic effect. Joan, with her mastery of image and publicity, would turn those reactions into a story that painted herself as composed, dignified, untouchable. Directors and crew were caught in the middle, often powerless to stop the tension. Cameras captured more than just the script. It captured the war simmering behind the eyes of these two legends. And because both women understood the stakes, career, legacy, and survival, the games became relentless. Yet, despite it all, professionalism never fully left the room. Every line was delivered, every scene was completed. The brilliance of the film came directly from the collision of their energies. The fear, the control, the anger, all of it translated into performances that were raw, electric, and unforgettable. What really happened on that set wasn't celebrity gossip. It was a psychological chess match between two women who had survived decades of a brutal industry. And in the tension, in the games, in the small humiliations and silent battles, the magic of Whatever Happened to Baby Jane was born. A masterpiece forged in fire and in rivalry. Awards season, where the feud turned public. By the time Whatever Happened to Baby Jane wrapped production, the tension between Bette Davis and Joan Crawford had already begun to seep into the public eye. But it wasn't until awards season that the rivalry exploded onto a stage the world could see. In Hollywood, awards were never just about prestige. They were validation. By this point in their careers, both women had endured decades of studio politics, public scrutiny, and whispered comparisons. Money could buy comfort, yes, but it could never buy immortality. And in the high-stakes world of the Academy Awards, recognition meant survival. It meant proving, for once and for all, that they still mattered, that they were still queens of the industry. The campaign for nominations became its own battlefield. Publicists worked overtime, sending stories to newspapers, planting interviews that praised one while subtly questioning the other. Critics dissected performances, analyzing every twitch, every glance, every nuance. Fans began to debate endlessly. Would Bette's raw intensity or Joan's polished presence claim the ultimate recognition? And then came the nominations. Both women were contenders, both immortalized on the same ballot. For the first time, the world was given a tangible measure of their rivalry. Who would be the one to triumph? Who would finally receive the validation that mattered more than any paycheck or box office success? The suspense was electric. Reporters hung on every public appearance, every photograph, every smile. Hollywood insiders whispered predictions, and both Bette and Joan felt the weight of history pressing down on them. Winning wasn't just winning a statue, it was a declaration that their decades of perseverance, talent, and survival had not been for nothing. The awards ceremony itself became a dramatic stage. Every gesture, every glance between the two actresses was scrutinized. The cameras didn't just capture the nominees, they captured the tension, the silent battle of wills, and the anticipation of who would finally win in a career-long rivalry. When the winner was finally announced, the outcome did more than hand someone a golden statue. It symbolized Hollywood's acknowledgement of endurance, talent, and strategy. And for that brief, shining moment, one woman could claim the spotlight entirely, even as the other remained a legend in her own right. Awards season didn't create the feud, it made it public, unavoidable, and impossible to ignore. And in the world's gaze, two of Hollywood's fiercest queens would forever be remembered not just for their films, but for the rivalry that turned every stage, every award into its own dramatic battlefield. The moment that broke any chance of peace. The awards night was supposed to be a celebration of talent, a glittering evening of gowns, applause, and Hollywood's brightest lights. But for Bette Davis and Joan Crawford, it became the night that would forever shatter any hope of reconciliation. The tension had been simmering for years, but until that moment, it had remained mostly behind closed doors, subtle, silent, and professional. Both women were masters of composure, capable of performing in front of cameras without revealing the storm inside. Yet Hollywood had a way of turning every spotlight into a magnifying glass, and this night would prove no exception. As the envelopes were opened and the nominees read aloud, the room held its collective breath. Both Bette and Joan were nominated for the same prestigious award. The stakes were higher than ever. It wasn't just a recognition of talent, it was a declaration of relevance, a validation that after decades in an industry built to discard women over a certain age, they still commanded power. Then came the announcement. The winner was revealed, and the reaction, small, almost imperceptible, yet deadly, was enough to ignite a permanent divide. One woman's victory was met with applause, the other's silence. But behind that silence was a mixture of shock, hurt, and something darker, resentment. It wasn't a dramatic outburst. There was no yelling, no screaming, no thrown awards. What made the moment so devastating and so unforgettable was the quiet intensity, the subtle glances, the barely restrained sighs, the way the winner's smile contrasted with the other's stiff composure. It was a moment that said, more clearly than any argument or insult ever could, that the rivalry had reached its emotional peak. From that point on, any chance of peace evaporated. The feud was no longer private, no longer a silent tension behind the scenes. It was cemented in history, witnessed by the world, and immortalized in photographs, press reports, and Hollywood memory. That single night became the emotional heart of their rivalry. It wasn't just about who had won an award, it was about decades of ambition, fear, and survival finally colliding. And in that collision, the divide between Bette Davis and Joan Crawford grew permanent. Hollywood had created two queens, forced them into the same spotlight, and then handed them a single crown. And in that moment, the war became undeniable, unforgettable, and unhealable. how the feud changed Hollywood for older actresses. After the storm of whatever happened to Baby Jane and the world watching the rivalry between Bette Davis and Joan Crawford, Hollywood had to take notice. It wasn't just the box office numbers that demanded attention, it was the undeniable proof that older actresses could still command audiences, still bring in money, and still dominate screens if the circumstances were right. For decades, the industry had quietly assumed that women over a certain age were liabilities. Leading roles were reserved for youth and glamour, and seasoned actresses were expected to fade gracefully into supporting parts or disappear entirely. But Bette and Joan shattered that expectation. They weren't just surviving, they were thriving, and the studio executives couldn't ignore the evidence. Audiences would come to theaters and pay top dollar to see two legends perform, even in the twilight of their careers. Yet, there was a caveat. The stories had to be intense. They had to be shocking, dark, and sensational. Ordinary romances or polite dramas weren't enough. Films like Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, with their psychological tension, horror, and twisted narratives, created a new niche, one that showcased the power of women who had been written off by youth-obsessed Hollywood. Suddenly, aging was no longer an automatic disadvantage. It could become a marketing tool, a reason for audiences to sit on the edge of their seats. This shift began to ripple across the industry. Studios started casting older actresses in roles that demanded complexity, menace, or theatricality. Horror, suspense, thrillers, genres that allowed for dramatic intensity saw a rise in films featuring women who were no longer young ingenues. And it wasn't just about casting. The way stories were written changed too. Female characters could now be flawed, obsessive, or frightening, and audiences were captivated. The legacy of their rivalry went far beyond the personal. It proved a broader truth. Talent, experience, and star power didn't disappear with age. They evolved, and Hollywood, ever hungry for profit, adapted. Casting directors began to see older actresses not as liabilities, but as dynamic tools to drive box office success, if the story was bold enough to match their intensity. In many ways, the feud between Bette Davis and Joan Crawford reshaped an entire era of cinema. It forced Hollywood to rethink who could be a star, what stories could be told, and how audiences could be captivated, not just by youth alone, but by experience, talent, and the raw magnetic energy that only legends could bring. Their rivalry didn't just change their lives, it changed the way women were seen on screen forever. The price they both paid personally. For all the glamour, the fame, and the acclaim, the rivalry between Bette Davis and Joan Crawford came at a steep personal cost. On the surface, they were queens of Hollywood, commanding attention, box office success, and awards. But behind the lights, behind the applause, the price of that survival and dominance was quietly mounting. Both women had fought tooth and nail for decades, navigating a brutal industry that measured worth by youth and beauty. Their feud, though fueled by structural pressures, became a lens through which the world watched their every move. And while audiences and critics saw electric performances, no one saw the quiet loneliness that came with it. To stay on top, both had to project strength at all times, leaving little room for vulnerability or genuine companionship. Bette Davis, whose fire and uncompromising approach had won her respect and prestige, often found herself isolated. Directors, writers, and even fellow actors feared her intensity. The very qualities that made her legendary made personal relationships fragile. The victories she achieved, both on-screen and in awards campaigns, were often celebrated alone, or with a public that understood her only as a persona, not a person. Joan Crawford, who had mastered reinvention and the art of public image, faced her own costs. Her careful cultivation of glamour and control meant that intimacy was often sacrificed. Emotions were measured, desires often subordinated to the demands of career survival. Even her triumphs, awards, box office hits, and acclaim couldn't fill the quiet emptiness left by years of relentless competition and calculated self-presentation.